So as a bit of a follow-up to my last video on my values as an ENFP, I wanted to share a few stories and situations that really shaped how I think about things and had a big impact on my life. Many of these are somewhat random situations, just one or two sentences someone said to me that have stuck with me, and I've literally thought about at least a couple times a year, if not a couple times a week, ever since then. And it's an interesting thing to think about. A friend of mine once said to me that the things you said that you think really impacted people, they probably don't even remember, good or bad. And the things you haven't thought twice about are probably the ones that have stuck with people. And that could be very true. So this brings me to my first story, which goes back to when I worked at Auto West BMW in Richmond, British Columbia. It was my first paycheck job. Now, since I was 10, I was working. When I turned 10, I got a paper route. When I turned 12, I got my babysitting license and babysat. At 13, I had this advertising company where I designed flyers for local businesses, and I think it was Printmaster Deluxe, or maybe Gold. It might have been Printmaster Gold. And so I was always doing things, but this was the first real paycheck job where they tracked your hours. It was a pretty good job for a 16-year-old. I got to be around BMWs all the time, learn from some of the salespeople and managers and stuff, meet with the clients, who sometimes were cool people, sometimes were massive pains in the butt, and of course drive BMWs, which was pretty sweet. So if at some time in the future you see me with like a 2002 E39 BMW M5 or M3, know that that's why I have it. It's just thing of like my first job, that was like the cool car back then. And if I ever need to buy a car, that's what I will buy. Now, as to what was said, my boss Jay had somewhat illegally parked. It's a bit of a gray area in the auto mall because you have all these car dealerships and then people coming to look at cars, and you really don't want to give people tickets who are there to shop and all this sort of thing. But he got a parking ticket and he was not happy about it. He was going off, whatever, about this parking ticket. And in particular, he was going off about the parking attendant, the person who gave him the ticket, about what kind of a terrible person this was. And I said something to him that you might have said before yourself. I said, hey, it's his job. Like, it's not the person's fault, it's their job. And Jay said something very interesting to me. Who applied for that job, Dan? Who applied for that job? And that has always stuck with me. We are not living under the Soviet Union. We have at least a few more years before the Chinese Communist Party fully pays off Hunter Biden and gets more rule over the world. So we have freedom in where we apply for jobs. This really, really stuck with me. It affected where I thought about working, but also how I judged other people. Now, I'm not saying I'm going to fully judge other people for their jobs and that. There are times when we might be desperate and we might need something to do. But if you watch my video on values, you know some of my values, one of which is being the purpose or outcome of what we do. And I have to say, I'm fairly harsh on people. Like, if someone works for a really bad company, I'm not one of those people who say, they just work there, it's fine. Like, if you're working for a company and that company's tied to some really bad things, I'm kind of going to put that on you. I might not do it when I first meet you, but if we've had a bottle of wine, it's probably going to come up because you can change jobs and that's ultimately up to you. And the thing is if as a society, we all buy into this thing of, it's just their job. Like, it's not their fault, it's the company. But who is the company? If we all say it's okay to work for evil companies, then why are those companies going to stop being evil? If suddenly we all decided that, hey, if you work for one of these really bad companies, then you're not getting invited to my house. You're not coming to my famous annual Czech Prague Halloween Christmas party. You're not invited anymore. Then maybe people would reconsider working for those companies. Maybe those companies would have to pay even more on top of the going wage because no one wanted to work there, which would make them less and less profitable. And then these companies might think, hey, if we were less evil, people might actually want to work for us and we wouldn't have to pay so much extra to get people to work here. And then we'd actually make more money, so maybe we should be less evil. So yes, I have to be honest, I am a fairly harsh critic of the choices people make. And I know we have to be careful, especially as ENFPs, about this, because sometimes we make quick judgments and we don't really understand the big picture of the world. There are so many things I believed at times that when you really understand how an industry works or the full cycle or repercussions of a certain choice in our lives, you realize it's not so black and white. So we do have to be careful with this. But for me, I do hold judgment about the choices people make. And I think if we did that more for ourselves and for other people, we'd actually end up with a much better world where we were responsible for the things our companies did. Not in some crazy way where if you ever worked for Apple and now Apple is tied to slave labor, say in the Uyghur region, then you're evil forever. But that if you work for a company and you know that they're tied to some bad practices, that you should change. And then people would be like, oh, that's really cool. You changed. You made a great choice. Not that it would be some blacklist on you for the rest of your life or anything like that. The next conversation that had a big impact on how I viewed people was back in university when I was discussing politics with a friend, specifically about how he was going to vote. And a little background on the parties we had a choice from in our province. One were called the Liberals, and they were slightly more business oriented than the other party in discussion, the NDP. The NDP is the more left party, which would lower tuition and a lot of other progressive issues. And the Liberals are sort of a central party. Now, center in Canada is more liberal than most countries left in many cases, at least at that time. But the Liberals were the party that this friend would normally have voted for. Like his belief system and what he thinks about the world and what's right for the world and his views on business and everything else would lead him to vote for this party. And I knew he generally supported this party. And then I asked, who are you voting for? And he told me he was going to be voting for the NDP. This confused me. He explained that he's a student right now and the NDP will lower tuition, therefore he's going to vote for the NDP now. Now at the same time, he believed that the NDP was probably worse for the province, that ultimately the taxes on maybe his parents or other people might be worse, that the long-term budget repercussions on the province would probably be bad, but he'd get lower tuition and therefore he was going to vote for them now, and then when he graduated and had a job and was paying more taxes, he would vote for the other party. That actually blew my mind. Maybe I seemed like a naive idiot, and I probably was a naive idiot at the time, but I always sort of thought that you had your principles, you had the things you believed in, and then you found the party that was most aligned with that. Now maybe you thought about what was right for the country at the time, like you might have principles that a certain party isn't aligned with, but you think, okay, this is what the country needs right now, so let's vote for that person because it's good for the country. Okay, but this was weird to me, to vote in a way that you didn't think was really good for everyone or anyone else and didn't really align with your values, but you were like, yeah, it will benefit me right now. It's probably how most people vote, which explains special interests and lying politicians and a whole lot of other issues we have. And I guess it goes back to one of the values I expressed in that earlier video on ENFPs and our value system is the utilitarian view of the greatest good for the greatest number of people. If more of us maybe followed that and had a value system and voted that way, it might be interesting what would happen with the world. So that conversation changed how I thought about other people and how I thought maybe a little bit about elections and democracy and everything else. When I realized, wait, in many cases, people aren't even trying to vote for who they think would be best for the country or their family or their community. They're just voting purely in self-interest, and that changes things a lot. This leads us to another situation actually that happened in university. It happened a lot, which was student elections. And I had a front view seat for many, many elections. And in many cases, I noticed the person who would have been best for that role did not win. And I know it's very hard to say who would be best, how would you know? But we sort of know from the results of what happened in those positions, as well as looking later at what people maybe accomplished after school or other things. So there were certain elections where I know it sounds really weird and biased to say, but I really think I did know, and a lot of people knew who would really be best for that position and who would really do an amazing job and had the greater good of everyone in mind. And ended up losing because of, well, politics and personal biases or conflicts between people. And that, again, led me to realize a few things about the political system and about who actually gets elected, and realize, well, if this is happening in student elections in a small group, I mean, we're talking 50 people voting at most, well, this is definitely happening on a larger scale. And who is really getting into office? Like, by time we're seeing people running how much have they been filtered out? And the people who would really be great in the position, the people who really just cared about the greater good but weren't good at playing the politic game and making alliances and everything else, how many of those people aren't even getting to the election because they're filtered out early on? So you might see a theme coming together here with some of these stories about maybe not having the most trust in the competence of government. And there was one more situation, a rather recent one, that was perhaps a cherry on top of that, and that was, of course, COVID, and how COVID has been handled in many countries around the world. Now, during the first wave, I was in Spain, and you could say, how would anyone know? How would anyone anticipate this? This is something I hear a lot when I attack governments in private conversations. It's not something I regularly do on YouTube, but when I attack governments about their handling of this crisis, people say they had no way to know, they had no way to know. They did. There were signs going back into February, into January. I had friends in China, so I was paying more attention to what was happening. And there were situations like in Spain where there were cases of COVID in Spain, like community transmission being found. Cases were going up, every day, 50% a day. And the government encouraged people to get together for a large protest because it was in the government's best interest for this protest to happen to help them push a bill through. And they encouraged people to go out on a massive protest. I think on the 8th of March, there were cases from the beginning of March. The government said, it's fine, we don't have to worry about it. By the 15th of March, the entire country was in the strictest lockdown in the world. And the signs were all there. I was watching doctors, professionals on YouTube going back into February saying, there's a pandemic, what are governments doing? And it was handled terribly. And there's been so many ways it could be handled better. And we see that now with the second wave, the third waves, that even when everyone knows what is happening, and everyone can look back on the Spanish flu, for instance, almost 100 years ago, following the same sorts of patterns, these aren't hard things to learn from. So last year, maybe more than any, has really solidified some of my beliefs about bureaucracy and about large governments and about almost having to look out for yourself. I've mentioned before that I try to avoid the news, and I think sometimes people think this is because I just don't care about the world. And it's actually the other way, is that when I get into the news and get into politics, I get so into it because I see what is wrong, I see what could be done, and I do care so much that I have to go off it because otherwise it just becomes almost an obsession for me. And so my aspect of not following the news is because I've realized that this system is more than I can take on, at least at this point. Maybe with your support, a few million more subscribers, we can make more of a dent. But even then, one of my best friends has a political channel. He has millions of subscribers. And he speaks at events and he has an influence in politics. He is sometimes talking to politicians and advising them and getting some inside details. But the impact even then is minimal. The ability to actually change the system and make big change is not there. And so what I have found for myself is having that independence and building my life in a way that gives me that independence to choose where I live is really important. If you've heard me talk in other videos about moving around and living in different countries and having location independence, yes, some of it is about the ability to be somewhere sunny in January. Some of it is about the ability to design your life and just live somewhere maybe with a better cost of living or better weather or people you connect with more or whatever. That's definitely part of it. But part of it too is also tied to the ultimate independence, that if the place I choose to live, the government is falling apart, that I can say, hey, I'm not going to pay taxes here. I'm not going to support this. I don't want my future kids to be living here. I'd rather move somewhere with people and a government that is aligned with my way of thinking. If you read the 10 rules on my website, there are 10 rules there. I actually wrote those back in 2013, and it's a bit of a trip to read them now and see maybe how some things have changed and how some things have really impacted my life. And one of the rules I think it's number 2, but I couldn't say for sure. Probably one of you knows more than I do, is don't waste energy attempting to change the system. Figure out what you want in your life. Follow my value, if you want, of utilitarianism. Do good for the world. Do the greatest good you can for your family, your community, your friends, and the world as a whole. But don't get caught up trying to change the system, because it may be a losing battle. And if we are to win that battle, I think it is from the ground up, and that comes from change within communities. And the more of us who are doing work we love, the more of us who are aligning our lives with what we really want, I think that might be the key to making the world a better place. Because when people are unhappy, are scared, maybe are living a life of scarcity because they're not making enough money, that's not a great place to make good decisions about the greater good. It's very hard to think in a utilitarian way if you're desperate and struggling or angry or frustrated, right? It's hard to think about the greater good for everyone else. So for me, my manifestation of this rule and utilitarianism is having that location independence and the ability to change where I live or where I operate based on my values and what countries are doing and everything else. And this year, well, I should say last year, more than ever has really solidified that. And something I will talk about a bit more in other videos. I don't have a lot of videos, I think, telling people how to live in terms of a location independence, work for yourself, where to live kind of thing. I usually say, hey, here's how I do it, and it's a pretty cool way to live, but you do what works for you. You might have no interest in this. But the last year has made me think more and more about not pushing that on people, but at the very least sharing a little bit more about why I live this way and why I think it's important, and maybe having a bit more resources to help you do the same. Because certainly last year really, gave the stamp of approval to some of my value systems. And for me, last year was one of my best years, and we were able to adjust very quickly where we were and what was going on and how we lived based on the COVID situation and how governments reacted and everything else. And that really was a privilege. And when I was talking to people throughout the year who didn't have that ability, I had a bit of almost guilt or regret, like maybe I should have been pushing people a bit more, maybe like even people in my own personal life, because it may have been beneficial for them to have that kind of freedom. So if I share more on that later on, know that that is why. If you made it to the end of this video, then I'd love for you to subscribe if you're not already a subscriber to the channel, and hit the bell. I publish new videos each and every week, usually a little bit shorter than this one and a little bit less of story time, although who knows what I will do going forward. My mission at Dreams Around the World is to help you become the best version of yourself, all while creating the most awesome life possible for you and those you love. I'll see you in the next video soon.